So SAP, everyone on the phone here should be very familiar with it. You wouldn't be on this call if you weren't using SAP. But the good news is that you are working with the leading provider of ERP software in the world. We actually have some statistics and reports that we did on SAP and ERP customers, and we found that 26% of all customers that are implementing some type of ERP system, they're using SAP. They actually are the leaders in this space, followed by Oracle and Microsoft Dynamics, respectively. SAP, even today, is in a lot of short lists for companies that are looking for ERP types of solutions. They make up over 60% of the short lists that we've seen in the marketplace. And because of this, there's a lot of power and advantage that SAP provides. It provides a lot of transactions to help you align your strategies and your operations, looks for areas to reduce costs through increased flexibility, and then provides some sort of governance within all your financial transactions, now CRM transactions that could be happening in your environment. Next slide. So when you look at typical SAP projects, and I'm pretty sure everyone on the phone understands this, they are typical things that you see or some characteristics of a typical SAP project. One, I would say most of your transactions are very document and process-centric. As you can see, the gentleman holding a stack of papers. So it is a lot of document information gets moved throughout different processes within the organization. What we found from our research and study, around 69% of the people are still using SAP GUI today. And as they're using SAP GUI and entering this information throughout the process and associating documents throughout the process, they find that it requires a lot of customizations in the UI and the UI interfaces. Not only when you do those changes in interfaces, a lot of that customization is done through an SAP language called ABAP, which some of you guys are fairly familiar with. And in some cases, they use Java and C#. Now, what happens is when you do a lot of these customizations or require these customizations, it requires a lot of effort from your IT organization, and typically we find that the implementation cycles are quite long. Because of these customizations and change, it makes it very, very difficult for customers to actually migrate to the latest version of SAP. From our study that we've done and customers that we've talked to, we find that over 50% of customers today are not even running on the current version of SAP. They're looking to us and solution partners for BPM to help them build out their migration plan, which typically takes between 18 to 24 months. Right? Next slide. Some of the implementation facts that we see from customers that we work with, and also our big business partner like IBM Global Services, which is one of the leading provider of SAP implementations. We found that 62% of SAP projects are over budget and late, and that's primarily because of a lot of the customizations and things that need to get done. Second thing, we found that everyone's trying to move towards doing vanilla implementations. We're starting to see this number increase from last year, but as of today, 21% of the current implementations of SAP are actually moving towards the vanilla implementation. But still, there's a lot of customers that are not doing vanilla. They find that a lot of their project implementations take roughly about 18.5 months, which means that you'll come up with a strategy of doing a new project with SAP. You're not able to recognize that until almost 2 years after you kicked off the project, which gives people spend around SAP projects roughly about $2.5 million is what they typically spend on a given project. Because of the spend and the time period, really only 31% actually see the benefit of doing these implementations, just because they're so long, they're so tedious, they're so cost absorbed. And what you'll notice here in this statistic, 69% of them are disrupted. They're disrupted because business changes direction of what they want to do. Maybe they might run out of budget or cost. So there are a lot of reasons why customers today, SAP customers, are trying to find a different way and a different approach to do SAP. Next slide. So when you look at an opportunity, what we think are good opportunities where BPM or business process management could be a great approach is really in these 4 different areas that our customers are challenged right now. Providing real-time visibility, understanding how the processes work today, where things are within the process as they're continually running. Agility, as you know, with the dynamic natures of the markets today, things are changing at a rapid pace. So they want to be able to understand the SAP transactions by the days and weeks and not years and months. And especially if they want to make changes to the transactions, they want to be able to see the results of those changes much faster. Finding areas to be more flexible in the way that drive the SAP transaction. Right now, flexibility tends to be a little bit of a challenge because a lot of that customization and changes requires a lot of IT. Business people want to have the power to be able to make the changes to the process without having to go talk to multiple different groups to figure out how to make those changes. And then last but not least, and not a lot of SAP customers are doing this unless you're using Business Office, is defining controls. How do I measure how efficient my SAP process is? Are we really adopting to what customers are needing or asking us to do within our organization? Have we aligned our SAP process initiatives with corporate goals that we're trying to achieve? So these are some of the common challenges that we see with SAP customers where they're starting to look at BPM or business process management as a vehicle to help drive change within the organization. Next slide. So this poses the question, would making your SAP process much more visual so that the business people can see it, understand it in the midst of the transaction of how the transaction is performing to find areas where bottlenecks could happen, would that be really helpful? Would that really empower the business to have more control of how SAP transactions are executed today or even designed today? And we feel from presenting our value proposition to our customers, they're saying this would be a great answer to the problems, that all the common challenges that they're going through. This would be a great solution for their approach. Next slide. Now, where BPM intersects with SAP and how we find it working together is really kind of in these 4 different areas, really modeling your process. A lot of people are in the SAP Lifecycle, you go through a blueprinting phase. So a lot of people are using different tools like Visio or maybe Eris. Some customers are using Provision to model their process. But it'd be great if they can use a platform that can model how their operations or how their SAP transactions interact and align with their corporate goals and initiatives visually. And let the business people participate just as the IT participate to build that model. Once you build that model, you can deploy it into an engine that will orchestrate those transactions across your organization, where now the model is actually driving how the flow of the SAP transactions in the process actually works. And then while you're doing that, being able to collect KPI data, information on how my process is performing, where are the areas that we're getting bottlenecks, what are things that need to change, what are some of the decision points that we're actually making within a process. So collecting all that information helps you better understand how SAP is being utilized within your organization and find areas to bring more efficiency in every one of your SAP transactions. All right? And then last but not least is really control, and that's really in the governance space. So you want to make sure all the work that you're doing in SAP, every single process and transaction aligns with some of the compliances that you set as an organization, or even federal compliances. You've got to make sure that they all align. And really this tool or this approach gives you a better way to manage or drive SAP within your organization. Next slide. So some of the common areas where we've talked to customers about utilizing BPM for their SAP environment are really on these 5 different areas. One is, how do I avoid doing large amounts of customization? Because customizations are what prevent you to migrate, which migration costs typically are about 4 times the maintenance cost that's spent within using SAP. How do I protect my upgrades and migration? We just talked about that. Reduce dependencies on ongoing consulting services. So what we find, if they're able to adopt a methodology and approach, they don't have to have the handcuffs that large consulting organizations that know more about your SAP practice than you do. They'll be able to now take ownership of it. What we found when we talked to some of these large, if you talk to any SAP customer, enterprise class SAP customers, they find when you talk to the SAP program manager, they don't really know how their SAP environment runs because they depend on a Deloitte or they depend on Accenture to actually run that system for them. Now, with BPM, they can get visibility. They can understand exactly how the processes work. They can understand and take ownership of the SAP transactions. And that's where we feel that now business people can actually own their SAP programs instead of relying on consultants. Typical SAP implementations are done in a very waterfall approach. As I mentioned to you before, typical SAP implementations are about 18.5 months before you start seeing results. With BPM, our approach is very agile. You'll start seeing results between every 4 to 6 weeks, and you'll see little iterations and change that happens within the transactions. One of the beauties of that is you can start taking advantage of things that change dynamically within the marketplace. You know, as your competitors are changing their approach, you can rapidly change your approach too. As the markets change, you can dynamically change it. As business rules or compliancy rules change, you can change it, and you don't have to wait these long cycles to actually apply those changes. And last but not least, as I mentioned to you, moving from rocky road to vanilla, how do I do a vanilla implementation? Really, the only way to do a vanilla implementation is really just doing it through BPM. Next slide. This is where the areas where we find BPM could add value or incremental value as you're using or adopting the methodology and the technology throughout the life cycle of SAP. First, a lot of companies that they're starting to plan out their SAP initiatives is really kind of getting a process modeling environment involved in blueprinting your process. A lot of people use Solution Manager as a repository for processes and other transactions and business objects that are stored for SAP. But I would say over time, as customizations are done, the processes that are really running your organization is different from Solution Manager within Solution Manager. So kind of migrating, upgrading, Solution Manager isn't really your center of record of your process. What we recommend using this approach is how do we get a process model, modeling the process and understanding the process aligned so that Solution Manager is your true repository process. Once you do that, then you can actually use a platform to define your process, build your KPIs and your measurements, all the way through building transactions that are driven by BPM, the BPM engine, so that it's driving the flow of the process. Other areas that you can use BPM for is both for integration, for automating some of the decision points, and also automating the process. We're going to actually introduce you to one of our business partners that actually have created a piece of technology that enables you to do that. And we find these customers starting to see incremental value as they're applying the BPM best practices and technology within their organization. Next slide. So this slide really talks about how we feel that interaction could happen between BPM and SAP. Really, when you think about SAP, there's two real main buckets how the SAP system is used today. One is a system of record where all your transaction data is actually stored. And two is really how you're collecting that data and where you're getting that information from. And then we call that the system of engagement. That's really where a lot of the customizations are done today. And what we're recommending, where BPM makes sense, is let's not focus on the system of record because SAP does that the best. That's why they're the market leaders in the space. But let's find different ways. It could be through mobile. It could be through desktop. It could be through social technology. How can I find ways that people, my customers, my partners, my employees can interact with SAP and not have to do these huge 18-month projects to actually make these different touch points available to them? So we think that BPM really fits when you're working in the system engagement phase of SAP. Next slide. And when you're able to achieve that, that's when you can really truly leverage a vanilla SAP implementation. And our definition of vanilla SAP implementation is really using SAP for what it's good at, which is the repository, holding the master data, having the core process transactions aligned, so that they align with the financial records that need to be maintained, and also some of the governmental compliances requirements that are required. But let the BPM layer be the layer to help you communicate or be the collaboration layer between people and your SAP system. That will help you reduce all that customization that you need to done and write all this ABAP code to actually do these changes. All right. One of our partners today, as I mentioned to you, IBM, has a solution. I thought we would spend the balance of this session to go over how that solution actually works. So, Stuart, let me pass it to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Michael. As was mentioned earlier, my name is Stuart Jones. I am a IBM Smarter Process Solution Architect. So I spend my time helping clients to understand how all of the different bits of their solution fit together, and the two bits we're going to talk about today are Smarter Process and SAP. And I'm going to go into, firstly, some of the detailed capabilities that we provide in our Smarter Process for SAP approach, and we'll also talk about some customer examples that we have. And lastly, I will show you a couple of demos that illustrate the capabilities that we provide within this approach. So this page here shows all of the different interaction points that IBM Smarter Process, which is shown kind of in the top left center of the page here, has with SAP. And let's start in the bottom left-hand corner. The first set of capabilities is oriented around Solution Manager. As Michael was saying, a good number of customers, not everybody, but a good number of SAP customers use the Solution Manager component that manages their business process hierarchies. And so there is a set of definitions of the set of transactions that make up a process. As he also mentioned right at the beginning, much of this is document-centric processing, and there is no firm visual definition of the process within the Solution Manager environment. So what we provide within our Smarter Process approach is the ability, using SAP's documented APIs, the ability to import the BPH from the Solution Manager environment into the Smarter Process environment. And you can see on the picture here, we have an illustration of that, where the diagram, the process in our picture at the top, shows a visual representation of the separate SAP steps within a business process hierarchy. And so we provide that ability to import from SAP the definition of what that process looks like, and also information about which transactions run at each step, each of the boxes in that picture, which transactions run at each step within those activities. You'll notice that the arrows between Solution Manager and the IBM BPM environment are both ways. So we can also take a process that is in the BPM environment and export that process back down to Solution Manager. So it's possible, once we've imported our business process hierarchy from Solution Manager, to make changes. There might be additions that we want to make. There might be changes that we want to make in existing transactions within the environment. We can take any changes that we made in the BPM environment at the top and export those back down to Solution Manager as necessary. So we've got full interaction with the Solution Manager environment from the point of view of business process hierarchies and the visual process representations that are available in the IBM environment. Let's move along the bottom of this page to the bottom right-hand corner. SAP defines a set of services within its environment, the SAP Enterprise Services, and those are represented within the SAP environment as web services. Our environment, IBM BPM, supports web services, and we can import the definitions of those SAP Enterprise Services into the BPM environment and make use of those services as and when is appropriate in the environment. Moving up to the top right of the picture, we have further capabilities that allow us to interact directly with the SAP runtime, which is white box in the top right-hand corner. We do that in several ways. They were mentioned back on page 10 when we mentioned the SAP capabilities, and I'll summarize them again here. We can use the NetWeaver UI to open a window directly into an SAP transaction. That window will look exactly the same as a regular NetWeaver UI user, but that interaction is embedded inside of an IBM BPM process. So our SAP transaction, the discrete transaction execution, becomes part of a broader process, and we can do some interesting things in terms of the information that goes into that transaction and the data that is available within that transaction in terms of using that in the BPM process, and I'll show you a demo of that in a few minutes. We can also use the programmatic interfaces into SAP. So we have integrations into the SAP BAPIs. We have integrations into RFCs. We have integrations into several of the other asynchronous interfaces that are available for iDocs and similar. And so we can make programmed calls into the back-end SAP environments. And so if we want to treat SAP as a service provider versus going into a SAP UI, then we can do those kinds of things as well. We have a SAP adapter that supports all of those different standard SAP interfaces, and we can allow our callers to call SAP, get the information back in a more programmatic way. We can also collect monitoring information from SAP. And so if we have a set of SAP transactions that are executing in our SAP environment in the top right, we can collect information, events about that execution, and use that to get visibility into what's going on inside of the SAP environment. Which transactions are running, when are they running, how long are they taking, all these different sorts of metrics that allow us to get a better view of what's going on in the SAP environment and who is executing transactions in that SAP environment. We can apply those sets of capabilities at various stages in an SAP lifecycle. And so the first one, a new SAP implementation, we can participate and add value to the SAP blueprinting environment. Again, I'll show an example of this in a few minutes' time, but in summary, we can provide the ability as part of the blueprinting process to provide a better visualization of what will be happening within an SAP environment in terms of the various transactions that are executing. The feedback that we get from customers that we talk with is that particularly business users have challenges visualizing what a sequence of SAP transactions is really going to look like and what end capabilities they're going to provide within an environment. And one of the reasons that SAP blueprinting is such an expensive and time-consuming set of activities is that the business teams have that difficulty in figuring out and seeing just exactly what's going on within the SAP environment. We can use our capabilities, the guided workflow in particular, but also the import from SAP Solution Manager, to pull in a business process hierarchy and to immediately provide a visual view of what's going on within that environment. And again, I'll show you a demo of that in a few minutes' time. For stable SAP implementations, we can provide significant assistance when, as Michael was saying, customers are looking at non-vanilla implementations. It's certainly true that many SAP users are trying to avoid customizing their SAP environments, and the benefit that we can provide here is providing the customization components within the BPM environment rather than modifying RBAC code within the SAP environment. And it's that modification of code which typically causes such elongated cycles when we want to migrate from one SAP release to another. And so that kind of gets us onto the idea at the bottom of SAP version migration. If we can remove from a stable system the customizations as much as is possible from that stable implementation, then when we get to that version migration step, things are going to be much easier in terms of the cost and the time that it takes to go from one version of SAP to another. I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but what this shows is the cost savings that we have found thus far when our clients are using Smarter Process for SAP versus doing things purely within the SAP environment. As was mentioned before, SAP projects can be significantly expensive. And so you can see here that a 10 to 15 or a 25 to 30% saving rapidly puts you into 7-figure savings in terms of the amount of, firstly, cost, but also time that can be saved for each of the different steps that we're illustrating here on this page. A couple of customer examples to illustrate how real customers are using the capabilities that we provide in their environments. This example here is from a large toy company. If you recognize the toys down in the bottom right-hand corner, you can probably figure out which company it is. But this company uses SAP and connects SAP to their business processes in 2 ways. Firstly, they collect events from the SAP environment around orders that are now necessary, about levels of building materials and other collateral that they need from their suppliers, and can get information from the SAP environment that drives reordering within their infrastructure. So they use SAP as a shoulder tap, if you will, to alert processes that reorders need to take place. A lot of that reordering activity doesn't take place within SAP. It takes place with negotiations and interactions with various supplier companies and other entities, and that's the part that takes place within the BPM environment. And the second use of SAP is that once all of that's agreed, we figured out who's going to be the supplier out of the choices that we've got, what we're going to order from them, when we might expect delivery. When all of that information is available, then the BPM process talks back to SAP using those programmed interfaces that I mentioned before in the SAP adapter, and uses SAP's system of record capabilities to record all of the information about the orders that are being generated and processed within the BPM environment. So this company is using SAP at the beginning as the driver of reordering activities through BPM, and also using SAP at the end of the process to update what the information, the state information, the record information that's kept and maintained in the SAP environment. Second example is of an apparel manufacturer, and this was all about their SAP blueprinting activities. And as I mentioned before, one of the challenges that they found was that when they were dealing with a large set of processes, and they're dealing with 300 SAP processes or business process hierarchies within their new environment, they wanted a way to enable particularly their business users to figure out exactly what was going on from these proposed business process hierarchies, and to be able to quickly understand and approve the development activities that were going on within the SAP blueprinting activities. And they use import from Solution Manager, so they're still doing the blueprinting inside of SAP and still using Solution Manager for storing those BPHs and the other associated documentation, but they're using BPM in order to take some of that information out of Solution Manager, visualize it quickly and effectively, and approving the changes that are being proposed for those transactions, and then getting to the end of those blueprinting activities much, much faster than they would ordinarily have been able to do. And so their real benefit here is the improved speed and the cost savings that they've gotten from their SAP blueprinting activities. I now want to move on to show you a couple of demos of the sorts of capabilities that we provide within our environment.
Stuart?
The first one that I'm going to... Yes?
This is Tom. At this point, there's a question that's come up, and it does come up very often, which is when you're looking at various alternatives, you choose which one you're going to use, and certainly SAP might have BPM approaches as well. Could you comment on some of the reasons why the customers are choosing the IBM BPM platform over other choices?
Okay, sure. SAP, within inside its own set of functions and capabilities, actually has, last time I looked, 3 different workflow or BPM environments. And those environments are at various stages very good at handling interactions within the SAP environment. The challenge that all of the SAP capabilities have is that they're very good at handling things within SAP, but the moment that you try and mix the workload that you're doing, and you're doing some of your things in SAP, some of your things outside of SAP, and some things maybe in other ERP systems, because lots of customers have multiple ERP systems, or in other components, that's where having a solution that doesn't sit inside the SAP environment is advantageous. So most customers that we work with, if they've got workflows that are purely and only within the SAP environment, they might use SAP's BPM sets of capabilities. Where they look to us is where they've got anything that they need to do that steps outside of SAP. Because while you can just about do it with SAP, it starts to get very, very difficult and becomes a very technical problem to solve. And that, of course, elongates the time and effort that needs to be taken to do it. And we observe that we can do things in a heterogeneous way much faster with solutions like the IBM Smarter Process environment than we can with the BPM capabilities that are within SAP. So let me move on to this example. What I'm going to show you is an end-to-end view of importing a business process hierarchy from the solution manager environment and then setting the imported process up so that we can execute SAP components. And I'm going to show you this. I'm going to show you all of the different pieces that you have to do, and you'll see why I'm doing that as we get to the end of this demonstration. So the first thing we do, and this is the IBM Process Designer environment where we build solutions, we want to import a process application. And you can see here that I've selected the SAP Solution Manager as the source of my import. So we click OK, and what that does is to bring up a panel that asks me for all of the pertinent information about the SAP environment that I'm going to. And any of you who kind of know SAP well will recognize system numbers and SAP clients and things like that. So you have to provide the information that tells it which solution manager, because there might be several, that you want to operate against. And it will then introspect that solution manager environment, and it will show you all of the different projects. So you can see here I've got a bunch of SAP Solution Manager projects that I can choose to import from. We will select one of these. I'm going to be SDemo down at the bottom, and that will then show us all of the business process hierarchies within that environment. Again, we're running this real time. I'm showing you everything for the different pieces. You can see here the 3 different environments that I've got. We're going to choose production planning, and we're going to import that into our environment. And that worked successfully. We've got no errors, so everything's functioned as it should do. And you will see here that we will import that definition. We've got something called SDemo at the top, same name as we had in our BPH, and we open up our business process environment, and you can see here we've got a process. It's called production planning, same name that it had down in the SAP environment, and you can see here we've got a string of 6 steps within this production planning SAP business process hierarchy. Here we're representing it as a BPM process. So I've got my process imported. You will see down at the bottom here of the properties at the bottom of the page that we have imported information from the from the Solution Manager environment, and we've got information about the different SAP transactions that are defined for our first step, which is material requirements planning. You can see here there's a couple of them. There's transaction MD01 and MDBT. They're equivalent MRP components, and one's batch and one's online. And you can see at the bottom right-hand side, the first one, MD01, is the default transaction that we're going to run in this environment. So we've got lots of information that was imported from the Solution Manager environment. Next thing we're going to do is include into our development environment here something called a toolkit. You'll see it's called the SAP Guided Workflow Toolkit. So we import that into our environment. Now we're going to open up this first step in the process. Let's look at its implementation. Well, it doesn't have one right now, and so we're going to add one. We're going to add a user task implementation, or at least that's the type of implementation that we're going to add. We now need to go and select which user task implementation we'd like to use, and we're going to select SAP transaction. So we select that, and we're pretty much done. So we can now go ahead and execute at the first step within our environment. Now, one of the nice capabilities that you get in the IBM BPM environment, in the top right-hand corner of my screen, you can see a little play button. It's just like the play button on any device that you might have. And so I can hit that play button at any time. I've only configured the first step here out of the 6 that we've got, but I can still press play, and we will go into what we call our inspector environment that allows us to see a single step through each of these different environments. So I'm going to select the first step. In the mid left-hand side of the page, you can see that material requirements planning is it's got a halo around it to show that it's the current step. And in the top right, I've selected that step, and I will say play that step, say which user ID you're going to use. I pick admin, and I can now run that step. And here I've got my SAP transaction running inside of my BPM environment. The reason I showed you every step in there is that from importing, or at least from starting my import to being able to get to this point and running a particular transaction in the environment, it took me a shade over 2 minutes. So in 2 minutes, I can get to the point here where I've imported a business process hierarchy from the SAP Solution Manager environment, and I've tooled up the first task to show the relevant transaction within this particular environment. So it didn't take me very long to get to the point where I can import from Solution Manager, I can get an SAP transaction up and running within my environment, and my end users can start to see, yep, this is the first transaction that's going to come up, is this the one that we thought was going to be right, and so on. So very quick time to value is one of the messages here from the sorts of things that we can do in this environment. So where is this useful? Well, it's very useful in the SAP blueprinting that we've been talking about thus far, in that I can import the definitions of business process hierarchies from Solution Manager. My end users can get a very visual view of what's going on in this business process hierarchy. They don't have to go to the Word and other documents that are associated with my business process hierarchy. We can run this. If I configured these 6 steps, well, it wouldn't take me 2 minutes. Maybe it would take me 10 minutes. But I can configure these steps very, very quickly and get something running, and I can show that to my end users, get validation that it's what they needed, and we can move forward with our blueprinting process in a much more efficient way than we might otherwise be able to do. The other significant benefit that you get from this is that we might import a completed, already defined business process hierarchy from Solution Manager, one for which blueprinting is completed many, many months ago, and use that as the starting template for building a solution within a BPM environment. And the kind of solution that I'm alluding to here is one where maybe we want to do some customization, but we don't want to do our customization in SAP. We import the existing BPH that has just the SAP steps, and then we can start to add in additional steps to our process picture that I've been showing in our solution designer product, and build what I'll call a heterogeneous solution, where we're heterogeneous because some of our steps are SAP and some of our steps are not. And that's going to be the subject of the second demo that I want to show you. So here on the screen, you can again see a business process in the IBM BPM product. There's just 4 steps. I'm not going to do anything especially complicated, but you'll get the idea from the way that this particular process will run. There are 4 steps. The 2 in the bottom row, the row that's labeled ECC on the left-hand side, those are my SAP transactions. And we have set those up in exactly the same way as I did in the previous example, in terms of they are human steps. They have the SAP transaction as the implementation of that human step, and they execute the transaction that's defined for each of those steps. My top 2 steps are just regular BPM user interfaces. They bear no relation to SAP whatsoever. And so those are steps that might just be end user interactions. They might interact with some other ERP environment. The world is your oyster in terms of the capabilities that we might implement in this row that I've labeled CRM on the left-hand side. So let's go run this process and see the sorts of things that it does in the environment. I've got this step called Create an Order Delivery To. There's the 4 steps inside of it. And I'm going to go to a user interface that we call our process portal. This is the default landing page that we have for our BPM product. So it's a default landing page. That means it's not necessarily the one you have to use, but this is the one we provide out of the box. And in this environment, I've got my user in the top right, Amy White. She is going to click on the Create Order and Delivery To process, and that will start a new instance. And in just a second, that new instance will pop up on the screen. There it is. We click on that, and here's the input data that we have for our sales order. So here's the information. I said it had nothing to do with SAP a minute ago, but of course, all of these fields here are fields that would exist inside of an SAP transaction. It's the sales order processing in this particular example. And so what we're doing here, we're presenting information in a very easy to consume manner, and we're allowing my end user, as you can see here now, to customize this information in case what's here isn't exactly what they need within the environment. And here they need to adjust the sales organization, the sold to party, the ship to party, and we also want to add another item to this set of materials that we're going to order for this environment. So we click OK. We're done with that, and now we see another task has popped up, Create Order. We click on this one. We need to enter a user ID and password because we're going off to SAP, and so we type in the user ID and password. I'm letting Amy use my SAP credentials to get into the system. We click OK, and up comes VA01. Familiar to almost every SAP user. A couple of things to note here. On the first page of VA01, we have pre-populated all of the information that was required in this step. So my end user doesn't have to get worried necessarily about remembering the difference between distribution channels and divisions, and remembering what information to type on this screen here. When we proceed and click on the Enter key, see here we're doing regular SAP processing. You can see here at the top of the page, I've got my sold to party and my ship to party. I've got my 2 rows down at the bottom for the materials that I'm ordering. And so most of the pertinent information is filled in for me. There might be some extra information that I need to type in as well. I could have pre-populated this if I wanted to, or I can do a kind of mix and match thing. I'll get you started and you fill in the specific things that you're responsible for. In this example, payment terms for this particular order. And so we enter some of that information manually to add to the pre-populated information that we had. We need to confirm the sales area for the customer. There's a few other things going on in SAP. So this is a live SAP environment. You're interacting in just the same way that you might have before. We've got multiple information about the items. So we've added descriptions and things like that. Now we're going to save this. And one of the things that we have in this environment now that it's saved is an order number. And so there's an order number that we can now extract from the SAP screen. So in the next step that we do, we're going to review what we just did in terms of a non-SAP transaction. This is back to pure BPM once again. You can see in the top half of this page all of the information that we used for input into the VA01 order that we just placed. And if we scroll down a bit, you'll see information that we have extracted out of the SAP environment. So you can see here that we've captured the order ID, we've captured the net value, and we've enriched the information that was associated with the materials rows. And so we've added the sales unit and the descriptions to the information that we provided. You can see the comparison between what we've got in the top half of the screen and what we've got in the bottom half of the screen. So we've got the capability to push fields and data into SAP, and we have the capability to pull information out of SAP and use it either in subsequent SAP transactions or inside of other BPM tasks, whatever those BPM tasks might be. So we're happy with that one. And the very last step, remember there were 4 steps in this, is to run another SAP transaction. It's VL01N in this case. And what we're doing here is we're pre-populating this transaction with the order number that came back from our VA01 transaction. And so we can retain the information inside of our environment and complete the business process. So what I showed there was a really simple business process, but it illustrates the point that we can combine SAP transaction steps with non-SAP transaction steps. We can pre-populate the SAP transactions and make them easier, particularly for occasional users to execute. And we can capture information from those SAP screens that we can use in downstream activities. So we've got the capability here to get very integrated activity with SAP. We're not changing the SAP environment that our more expert users might be familiar with using, because we all know there's kind of power users of the NetWeaver UI, and there's novice users of the power of the NetWeaver UI, and it's those novice users that often have a lot of trouble with figuring out some of the more complex SAP screens and what to put where. And we can provide significant benefit in terms of helping particularly those users in making good use of the SAP environment. Of course, we can also, I didn't make a big point of it in the demo, but we can also, of course, make sure that all of those steps are executed. A common complaint that we get from our SAP customers that we talk with is that they don't really know what's going on in their SAP environment. And some of their users sometimes execute all the transactions correctly, and sometimes they don't. If you put these things in a BPM process, you've got much more consistency and control of how these various steps are executed within the environment. With that, I'm going to hand back to Michael for a discussion of some of these other points.
Thank you, Stuart. And hopefully, just through the demonstration, each of you were able to see the power that you can leverage BPM technology to really do transformation in SAP. And I would say, us as being more practitioners in this space, we've seen a lot of different solutions and found that this one was very, very core. The great things about working with partners like IBM, they're also the largest implementer of SAP, so they're seeing some of the common challenges. So kind of taking all the use cases and the challenges, they've actually built the solution and really addressed kind of the different areas that you actually do customizations and implementations in the project, all the way from the blueprinting to actually doing the implementation when you're in the middle of a project, and also to the point of when you're migrating and getting ready to move to the latest version of SAP. So what we really found were some kind of three key areas that are value propositions for customers that are looking to implement this platform. One, in the deployment sense, is really the business blueprinting phase. Understanding the cost, time, and risk. Very, very powerful. We find that a lot of customers get immediate value just from blueprinting. Other areas we found is just as Stuart showed you in the demonstration, was the adoption from the end users. The interfaces look a lot easier to understand than looking at some of the traditional SAP GUI screens. So much more modernization approach for looking at it. The power of using the Smarter Process for SAP solution is not only can you use the forms within your desktop, you can extend it all the way to your mobile workforce. So being able to now leverage a web interface to interact with your customers and your end users when they're out in the road in the field, it gives you that ability and flexibility. In the operations perspective, is really helping your business people really participate in the development and transformation of your SAP processes. Now, that will not take away all your ABAP development, but it will reduce it significantly because now the business people can drive the change within the forms, they can drive the change within the business rules that happen within that transaction. And then in the strategic perspective, really being able to now use your resources to do more strategic things with SAP instead of more tactical things. So when we go and talk to our customers right now, their SAP programs are very, very tactical. Business people want us to do something, get these things built. And because the timelines to make this change takes so long, they can't think strategic. Now when you have these shorter cycles of 4 to 6 weeks, now they can start not thinking about what I need to accomplish now, but how can I leverage SAP much more throughout my organization to do transformation within our business. And I think that's where we've seen the most value from our customers that are taking this approach. Next slide. We talked about building a roadmap. The roadmap doesn't happen overnight. You can't build an SAP program or own your SAP program. What we recommend to do it is at a project at a time. Where we've seen success with our customers, and both IBM seen success, is where we go look and build a process matrix of all the different processes and transactions that happen in SAP and be able to map it out into a plan or a roadmap of adoption, right? So what we find is we'll do a real quick pilot to demonstrate the capabilities in about 4 to 6 weeks. That will lead into, I understand how the technology works. Let's look at some other projects within the same business unit or the same module that we like to make those changes. All the way to now, let's look at all the 3 or 4 different SAP modules and how can we really adopt this to bring change. So it's really a project to program approach and not a quick win shotgun approach to actually go and adopt this within your SAP program. So really the last slide that we have for you today is really talking about, hey, this is great. This is really good information. We like to try BPM as our approach and adopt it in our SAP program, but we don't know how to get started. Well, here at Salient IBM, we're committed to be your partners to make sure you're successful. What we've done is kind of these 3 easy steps of how we can work with you. One, after this call, we're going to have one of our sales specialists to reach out to you and try to schedule about a 30 to 40-minute conversation where we can start looking at areas of pain that you're dealing with in your SAP project's implementation. We like to find out, hey, what are some of the good fits that would make sense to start selecting a pilot for using this Smarter Process for BPM approach, right? Once we identify that and prioritize the potential projects that you could do, we like to engage with you guys a 90 to 120-day pilot where we'll be able to go and model the process, almost blueprint it out for you, move it into a BPM environment, integrate with your SAP environment, and show you a solution. And when you see the rapidness of development, just as Stuart showed you, he was able to go take an SAP transaction, pull it from Solution Manager, and made it available in 2 minutes. We think we can actually do that with a project. The next two components really talk about what we're going to be doing within the project scope, and then what solutions that we like to drive as both Salient and IBM as we work together to be your partner is to really help you guys start maximizing the value of your SAP investment. All right? With that, let me pass it back to you, Tom, so we can go into closing.
Hey. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Stuart. A lot of information here. We're right up to the conclusion of our webinar, so we've got some questions that have come in. What we will do is we will answer those questions and send them back out to all the attendees. And as Michael mentioned, we'll be doing a follow-up with some of our sales folks to answer any other questions about recommended next steps. So I want to thank everybody for your time and attention today. This concludes our webinar, and we wish you a great rest of the day.